Hey there, I'm Khara and welcome to Layer Up. Layers are the bread and butter of Photoshop. And because they're so powerful, they can sometimes feel really intimidating, especially if you are new to Photoshop and often even if you're not. But never fear, because simplifying things and making them easy to understand is totally my jam. And in this course, we're going to start at the very beginning. So you're going to learn exactly what a layer is and where layers come from and what exactly do you do with them. We'll start by digging into a composite image and taking a peek under the hood. Next, we'll build our own super fun composite step by step. You'll create layers from selections, from layer effects, and even from scratch. The downloads for this course include all of the course files and examples for the exercises that we'll be doing, so you can follow along right at home. There is also a resource guide PDF, and as a thank you to everyone who's watching, you can download my Make It Snow toolkit for free. You can grab your toolkit at kharaplicinich.com/make-it-snow. All right, are you ready to get started? Let's roll up our sleeves and jump right in. Before we build our own composite image, we're going to take a look at this livingroom.psd file. So first of all, if you don't already have your layers panel open, you can find it by going to the window menu and choosing layers. So one of the important things to understand and distinguish between is the view that you see over here when we look at our image and what we see when we look over in our layers panel. So when we're looking at the image here, we are looking at a top-down sort of composite view of everything that's in our image. So all of those layers, we're looking down from above and seeing them as a whole. So when we look here, this just looks like a photograph of a living room. And we see that there's, objects in that room, but we just see it as one photo. But when we look over in the layers panel, we see that there are lots of layers going on. If we look right here, we see that this layer is labeled Plant 1. And if I toggle that visibility of that layer on and off by clicking this little icon here, we can see that it disappears and reappears again. So we can see that this right here is Plant 1. This, of course, if we toggle that on and off, that is Plant 2. We also have a rug and a gray cat and an orange cat. And we have the gray cat's drop shadow. And we have the orange cat's shadow, as well as a sofa. And then we have our background, which is the room itself. So if I hide that, the room, the floor, the walls, a few other objects in the room all disappear because they are part of that background layer. So one way to think about layers that I find really helpful is if you've ever watched those documentaries about how animations used to be made before we did them on computers, you may have seen the animators work by painting and illustrating a background, and then they layered on top of the background animation cells, which are basically like transparencies, like you would put on an overhead projector, and they layered them on top of each other so that they could paint the different characters and the moving parts of the scene on those individual transparent cells, which is short for celluloid, trivia fact. And then they could move them around and swap them in and out and change them as much as they wanted to, and they didn't have to recreate the background. So the background stayed the same, and all the moving parts happened in different cells. And that is essentially the way that layers works. So for example, if I target the plant layer, that means I click to select Plant 1, and then I use my move tool, I can drag this plant around within the scene without disturbing any of the other layers or the background. So feel free to experiment, click on the different layers and grab your move tool right up here and just drag things around and have some fun with that. Another thing that's really important to know about the layers panel is that because the layers over here represent a cross section or a side view as opposed to the top down view in the main area, the stacking order makes a difference. So if we take a look at the rug that's laying on the floor and I target the rug layer by clicking on it, and let's say we want to tuck this rug and slide it in under the sofa. So if I clicked and started dragging it that way, we see that instead of sliding back and underneath the sofa, it looks like it's levitating and it's gonna float away on a magical carpet ride. So let's say we want to tuck that back. Okay, now we see that it looks like it's floating. And the way that we would fix that is by physically taking the rug layer and dragging it beneath the sofa layer. So in the layers panel, I'm going to click and drag that rug layer all the way down here and drop it. And now we see that it actually goes underneath the sofa. So the stacking order makes a difference. Layers make it possible to do all different kinds of things. So for example, we can adjust the blend mode and opacity of a layer. If we target the sofa layer here and we come up to the top of the layers panel, we see that the sofa is appearing normally. It's in what we call normal blend mode. So that's as you might expect if you like cut out a picture of a sofa and dropped it on top of another photograph, it would just cover up everything that it's on top of in the photograph. But we can change that. If we click where it says normal, we see a long list of different blend modes and we can just kind of mouse over there and you see them changing and the sofa is changing the way it appears. So if we choose, for example, overlay or soft light, we can actually see like through the sofa to that brick wall behind it. And while that might not be useful in this example, in lots of other things, that can be really important. We'll go back to normal blend mode, and then you can also adjust opacity. So maybe this sofa is going to just sort of fade away. We could take the opacity slider right up here, and if we click, we can drag this down, and now it just sort of disappears. Now it's barely there, or it's gone completely because the opacity is set to 0. So this is another really great feature of layers and the layers panel. One of the things that you might have heard people talk about a lot is layer masks. And just to kind of illustrate what they are, let's take a look at the sofa layer here. So when we look at the image, the sofa just appears as if it's in the room. But next to the thumbnail for the sofa, I can see this black thumbnail here, and that represents a layer mask. And just like the mask that you wear at Halloween could hide or conceal your face, a layer mask hides or conceals part of that layer. So if I disable this layer mask, we can see that the sofa is actually cut and pasted from an image where it had a white background. So the layer mask is giving us the flexibility to remove the background or hide it without actually erasing it. And that is handy for a lot of things. And we'll be creating a layer mask in our next example. At this point, you might be wondering, where did these layers come from? Like, how did they get here? That's a really good question. So layers can be made in lots of different ways. They can be made by copying and pasting something, a selection, for example, from either a completely different image or maybe within the image itself. And you can also create layers from scratch. And we're going to do all of those things in our next example. Before we move on, one thing I want to make sure that everybody knows is that when you are working with layers, it's really important that you save your work in the right format. Not all file formats can support layers. So for example, if you saved your layered composite as a JPEG, you would be really bummed out when you open it later and find that all of your layers had been smushed down to a flat background. As you work your way through this course, I encourage you to save your work And when you're choosing file format, choose PSD. Okay, so I hope you feel like this was a good little overview and that you feel like, okay, I can do this, because up next we are going to create our own composite step by step together. We're gonna need the cone image, we're gonna need the cherry, the drippy, pinkalicious, and pistachio spoon files. We are going to be starting with the ice cream cone image. And we can see that we have all this vertical empty space above our ice cream cone. And we are going to put it to good use by creating the most fantastic ice cream cone you could imagine, with big scoops piled high and whipped cream and a cherry on the top. Before we get into that, let's take a peek at what's going on in our layers panel. So we have the background that we're going to be starting with, and then you'll notice that there's a layer here that's not turned on, and even if you turn it on, you won't see anything. So it's basically just sitting here. I've called it style holder because we're going to use it for something special at the end of this project. So for right now, don't worry about it, just ignore it. Let's go and target the background layer. And we are going to begin creating our very first layer by selecting the cone, and we're going to copy the cone up into its very own layer. So to do that, we're going to first select the cone, and you can use whatever selection tool you like the most. I'm going to grab the object selection tool over here in the toolbar, and making sure that the background layer is active, I'm just going to click and drag a little box around the cone, and Photoshop will do the rest. Let's try that one more time. Photoshop, you can do better. There we go. The next step is going to be to copy that cone and put it up above in the layers panel in a layer of its very own. The keyboard is really the best way to do that, by pressing Command or Control J to jump that selection up into its own layer. So just remember J for jump. And if we look at the layers panel now, we see that Photoshop has created layer 1, and we can see that there's a little cone right there. Now in the image, of course, we don't see two cones because it copied the cone right on top of itself. So if I were to grab the move tool and then drag over, you see that now we have two cones. But we'll just go ahead and keep it there. I'm going to rename this layer, and you don't have to do this, but it's a good habit to get into, because once you start making layers, they pile up very quickly and it can be hard to tell what's what. So to change the name of this, we're going to double click right here, and instead of layer 1, we'll call it cone. And then you just type it in and press enter or return. And now we are ready to grab our first scoop called Drippy. So navigate over to the drippy.jpg file, and we're going to select the scoop right up here. And again, you can use whatever selection tool you want. I'm going to choose the quick selection tool. It's part of the W family here. And this tool, if you've never used it, is kind of like a magic wand brush. I'm going to enlarge the size of my brush here, and using the left and right bracket keys on the keyboard to change the brush size. So those are the brackets next to the letter P. I'm going to just pick something about like that and just kind of drag around, and you can see that Photoshop very quickly selects that. And now we're just going to copy this and paste it into our cone image. So we'll press Command or Control C, and I'll go back over here to our cone image, and I'll press Command or Control V. And you'll see that now that scoop appears in the image, and you'll notice that it automatically came in on its own layer. And that is what Photoshop does. Anytime you drag and drop or copy and paste from another image, Photoshop by default will just put it in its own layer, and that new layer will always be created directly above whichever layer was active when you brought it in. So we've got our first scoop. Now, if you look carefully at this image, you might have noticed that we've got a little bit of a lighting problem, because the lighting in the cone image is coming from the left side. That's why we've got the shadow over here to the right. And the scoop is like reversed. So we've got highlights on this side and this side is dark. Plus, it's a little bit too big for the ice cream cone. So we're gonna fix that by bringing up free transform. Keyboard shortcut, Command or Control T. That is going to bring up the transform box, and we can flip it by right clicking or control clicking and choosing, clear down here, flip horizontal. So you'll notice that just flipped it over, turned it around. And again, this is possible because this scoop is isolated from everything else in the image, being that it's in its own layer. And so that's good. Now we've got the highlight on the correct side for this image. It's still a little big. So to fix that, I am going to drag from the corner. And I'm holding shift because I like it when Photoshop behaves like that. But if you have the current defaults, then you don't have to hold shift. But you want to keep it proportional. So go ahead and scale that down. And we're not bothering with smart objects in this lesson, this course, because we're just going to keep it simple. So you may have heard about smart objects. They are great, but we're going to keep it simple in this exercise. So we've got our scoop. We have flipped it so the lighting is consistent. And now we are going to change the color. We'll come up to the image menu and choose adjustments, hue, saturation. And I'm going to drag this hue slider right here to the right until I get to about where it looks green, and I'll click OK. So we've copied and pasted, transformed, scaling it down and also flipping it horizontally, and we've changed the color. And now we're going to rename this layer by double clicking right on the actual letters here in the layers panel. We're going to call this green scoop and press enter. One scoop down, 3 more to go. The next one that we're gonna bring in is from the Pinkalicious file. So navigate over there, same thing, select the scoop with your preferred method, copy it, come back over to the cone image and paste. And again, Photoshop puts it in its own layer, and again, it's too big. So we're gonna scale it down, Command or Control T, for transform, and I'm going to scale this to a good size. I'm also going to rotate this because maybe we want it to be like this, but I feel like I want to spin it. So you'll notice that while you're in this free transform space, if you hover your cursor in the corner, you get that little curved, I call it a macaroni noodle. And while you see that, you can click and actually drag to just spin the whole thing. So rotate it till you feel like, till you feel like it looks good. Maybe about like so. And we'll go ahead and press enter or return to commit that transformation. Now I prefer for this scoop to be pink. It kind of already is, but it's very pale. So we're gonna adjust that the same way we did before. We're gonna come up to image, adjustments, hue, saturation, but this time, instead of just taking the existing hue and skewing it, this particular scoop doesn't have a lot of hue in it. So we are going to colorize it. So whatever hues might be in it, we're gonna wipe them away and recolor this whole thing. So I'm gonna put a check mark here next to colorize, and I'm gonna take the hue and drag it all the way to the right, and I'm going to drag the saturation slider way, way up. I feel like it's looking pretty good. We'll click OK. Before we move on, we want to make sure we remember to rename that layer. So I'm going to double click, and this is our pink scoop. Press enter or return. And now we're ready for, you guessed it, another scoop. This time we're going to be borrowing from our pistachio spoon image. So find your way over there. Same thing, select it as we did before. Whatever method you want. We're gonna ignore the little pink spoon for now, or purple. Copy, Command or Control C. Switch back to the cone image, Command or Control V, paste it in. You can use the move tool to position it press Command or Control T again. Scale this down. Don't forget to press Enter or Return to commit your transformation. And now, before we do anything else, we're going to rename this layer just Scoop. So we'll assign the color in a minute. Right now, come over to the Layers panel, again, double click to enter into the text there and just type Scoop and press Enter. When we changed the color of the other two scoops, we did it by making the adjustment directly on the layers themselves. We went to the File menu up here and we chose Hue Saturation Adjustment, and bam, we just applied it directly to that layer. And that can be great, but what can also be great is to have a lot of flexibility, because maybe later we want to change our minds and we want to try a different color or something else, and we don't want to be making so many adjustments over and over to our poor little pixels. So we want to do it non-destructively by taking that adjustment. Instead of applying it directly to the layer, we're going to take the adjustment and put it in a layer of its own. Here is how we do that. Down at the bottom of the Layers panel, this little button that looks like a little yin-yang or a half moon or something, you're going to click on that and then find where it says Hue Saturation. So it's the same adjustment, but instead of applying it to the layer, we're going to put it in its own layer. So we'll click on that and let's take a look at what happens. In our Layers panel, we now have this funny looking thing, and we have a mask, and then Photoshop names that layer Hue Saturation 1. So what we're going to do is change the color, and I want to make it more yellow, but you can do what you want. I'm going to drag this to be like -5, and I'm going to then boost the color because it's kind of pale. I'm going to bump the saturation way up. This adjustment is happening to the whole image. So we can see that if we toggle the visibility icon on and off, we can see there's the image before we made this adjustment. And if we turn it back on, there it is with the adjustment. And you can see that these other two scoops are like out of control, saturated right now. So wouldn't it be great if this adjustment that we just made could affect only that top scoop? Well, you are in luck because we can take advantage of something called clipping masks. So to do that, we're going to hold down the Alt or Option key on your keyboard, and you're going to hover your mouse in between the adjustment itself, in this case a Hue Saturation Adjustment, and the scoop that we want that adjustment applied to. And then we're going to click in between. So when you see that funny little icon that's a square with that little arrow, that's letting you know you're in the right spot. So then we're going to click, and now that adjustment will only show up wherever it overlaps with the contents of the layer directly below. In this case, the top scoop right here. So now we have this adjustment layer that's happening, and then here is the scoop that that adjustment is affecting. And if we change our minds at any time, we can always get back here by just clicking on this thumbnail. So even if I close this properties window or the properties panel, I can get it back at any time. Even if I save this file and open it a year from now, I can come back and maybe I want to change the color of that scoop. I can just click, double click right here on the little icon, and I'm right back in that same Hue Saturation panel. So this is just one type of adjustment that can be made in its own layer. So this is an example of non-destructive editing. So I'll go ahead and close this. And now to clean up our layers panel a little bit, we are going to group the adjustment with the scoop that it is applied to. So with the adjustment layer selected, hold down Control or Command and click on the scoop layer. So now that they're both selected, we're going to group them by pressing Command or Control G for group. Let's rename, instead of group 1, we'll double click and call it Yellow Scoop. Don't forget to press Enter or Return. And now you'll see that we have a little folder here with a little carrot, and if we open the drawer, click on that carrot, pull the drawer open, and you'll see that inside that folder, we have the hue saturation adjustment layer, and then we have the scoop that it's being applied to. So this just helps us keep our layers panel organized. You can make as many groups as you want. You can put groups inside other groups. They're really fantastic. So we'll go ahead and collapse that. And we are ready to add our top scoop, which we're gonna pretend is whipped cream. So instead of borrowing from another image, we are going to duplicate one of our scoops and then convert it so that it looks white, and it's gonna end up being like whipped cream. So target the pink scoop layer, and we're going to duplicate it the same way that we jumped the cone into its own layer at the very beginning. We selected the cone and then we copied it or jumped it up into its own layer. We're gonna do the same thing with the pink scoop, but we don't have to make a selection first because it's the only thing on that layer. So we can use the same keyboard shortcut, Command or Control J, to jump a copy of the pink scoop up into another layer. Of course, we don't see it because over in the layers panel, we've got that side cross-section view, and over here, we are looking from the top down, and this scoop is directly on top of itself. So now we can use our move tool to click and drag so that it's up on top of our yellow scoop. As we saw earlier, the stacking order matters. If we want this scoop to appear on top of this scoop, we need to do a little bit of rearranging. So I'm gonna click on the pink scoop copy and drag it carefully. Be careful now. You wanna make sure that you are dragging it above that yellow scoop folder. And it's really hard to tell the difference, but if you highlight it so that that blue outline is going around that yellow scoop folder layer, you're gonna be putting this duplicated pink scoop inside the folder. And if you do, it's okay, you can undo it and try it again. But instead, we wanna make sure we're dragging above that so that we just have a solid, just blue line here instead of a rectangle, just a line, drop it right there. And now we see that it appears on top. If this were whipped cream, maybe it's this big, but let's scale it down a little bit. Again, Command or Control T, and go ahead and move that down. I might rotate that a little bit and press Enter to commit it. Let's rename it by double clicking, and we'll call it Whip. And now we should probably get rid of the color that's in there. We could make another adjustment layer and then clip it again to the whip layer and then make another group. Or because we're just gonna keep it simple, we can just review what we did earlier and make another direct adjustment to this layer. So we'll come up to Image, Adjustments, Hue Saturation, and we're gonna take that saturation slider and drag it all the way to the left and click OK. If we zoom in on the image, so I'm pressing Command or Control plus to zoom in, we can see that it's got some rough, jaggedy edges, and it's got these funny little bits hanging out in a couple of spots. And just so we can practice and see how layer mask works again, we're going to mask that away. So if you remember, a mask hides things, just like the mask you wear at Halloween. We're gonna hide these little bits or rough edges to just kind of soften it up more like whipped cream. So to make a layer mask, we're gonna come down to the bottom of the layers panel, and there's this icon right here, this little button that some people say looks like a camera. It is a rectangle with a circle in the middle, and you're gonna click on that. And you'll see that Photoshop has added the mask, so it made a little icon right here. And by default, it's linked to the layer contents themselves. So if you move the layer, the mask will move with it. The mask right now is blank, so it's not masking anything. So to apply the mask or to create the mask, we're gonna use the brush tool. So I'm gonna press B for brush. And if you have something else chosen, go ahead and select a round brush. And I'm going to make my brush smaller by pressing the left bracket key that's next to the letter P. And if you want a harder brush, or maybe your brush is not as soft as you would like, you can come up and click right here on the little brush preview, and you'll see that there's a slider for the hardness value. I don't want it all the way hard, but maybe like somewhere in here. You want to make sure that we have black as our active color, and then we can just come over here and actually paint away that little edge. So in this sense, we're painting with a paintbrush, but it's behaving more like an eraser. But remember, we're not erasing, we're masking. So we're just painting on a mask to hide anything that we don't want showing up. So whatever kind of edges you think are a little too jaggedy to pass as a whipped cream, go ahead and just brush them away. If you make a mistake and you go too far, you can undo it, obviously, or you can press the X key, like exchange, and that is gonna flip-flop your foreground and background colors. So I'll press X, and now I've got white on top, and white removes the mask. So it restores the contents of that layer. So it's great because we're not erasing something and then it's gone. We're just masking it, and you can always edit your mask. All right, we are ready to get our spoon. So we're gonna go back to our pistachio spoon image, and this time we'll deselect this by pressing Command or Control D and using your preferred selection tool. I'm gonna use the quick selection one. I'm gonna put my cursor in here and just click, and it pretty much just nails it. Thank you, Adobe. So we'll press Command or Control C to copy, go back to our cone, and again, paste it in, and I'll use my Move tool. The keyboard shortcut is V, that's V for move, and drag that on up into position and scale it down, again with Command or Control T. So now we'll press Enter, and we need to move that spoon behind the whipped cream layer. So in the Layers panel, let's rename it, double click and call it Spoon. We're gonna drag the spoon layer below the whip layer, and that'll just tuck it in nicely. And I think now we're ready to add the cherry on top. So let's grab our cherry image. And for this one, I'm gonna select it again with that object selection tool. So let's copy it and come over and paste it. I can see that I need to move it up on top of the whipped cream. So we'll click and drag to move it on up there. Let's rename it while we're here, Cherry. I'm gonna press Command or Control T, and compositionally, I would like the stem on the cherry to point the other direction, away from the spoon. So we're gonna flip it over. And just like we did with that very first scoop, we're going to Control or right click within the transform box, and then we'll choose Flip Horizontal. And then I can drag from a corner. You can scale it down if you want. When you're happy with it, again, press Enter or Return to set it. I don't know about you, but this image is making me hungry. We're gonna go back to the background layer, and we're going to tweak the color of that background. So I'm gonna go down to the background layer in the Layers panel. So click to select that. We're gonna add another adjustment layer. And when you click to add an adjustment layer, it always adds that adjustment on top of whichever layer was active when you clicked to add the adjustment layer. And the way that adjustment layers work is that they're kind of like rain clouds, and their adjustment rains downward. So anything above the adjustment layer is not affected. So wherever the adjustment layer is, unless you clip it to a specific layer like we did when we clipped it to that yellow scoop, if you don't clip it to something, it will just rain down, and anything that's underneath it will be affected. So with the background layer active, we're gonna click that little yin yang button, and again, we'll choose hue saturation. So I'm gonna take the hue saturation and drag it to the left till about -15 or so. And then I'm gonna tone down the saturation just just a little bit by dragging that also to about a minus. And the beauty of this whole thing is, again, we did this as an adjustment layer, so you can change the color anytime you want. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I do want to brighten that background up just a little bit. So let's take a look at another type of adjustment layer that you can make. This time, click that yin yang and choose levels. And I'm gonna grab this mid-tone slider and just drag it to the left a smidge to just brighten things up. All right, and again, this levels adjustment is also non-destructive and can be tweaked at any time. So here, if we scroll back down, we see we've got these two adjustment layer rain clouds. One is adjusting the color, the hue and saturation. The other is adjusting the levels or the exposure. And because adjustment layers rain down, we didn't have to clip it to anything. The only layer that's down below is the background. So everything else is like up above the clouds where it is sunny and blue skies. Before we add the final finishing touches, remember that it's important to save your work. So because we've got all these layers going on, we want to save this as a PSD. So we would choose File, Save As, navigate to wherever you want to save it, and then down here for format, you just want to make sure that it's set to Photoshop. Then you can go ahead and press Save. Now that we've got our image built and we've saved our work, we're ready to add some special effects. One of the things that's really important when you're building composites is paying attention to lighting. So as you saw earlier, the drippy scoop, we flipped to make sure that the lighting was consistent with the lighting in the scene. And also, if we're building a composite like this in this scene, we would have very subtle shadows underneath each of the scoops and the cherry on the top. And it's very simple. We're gonna come up here to the cherry layer. We'll start at the top and work our way down. At the bottom of the layers panel, you will notice a little button that says FX. If you click on that, there is a list of all different layer effects that you can add with the touch of a button. The one we're interested in is drop shadow. So I'm gonna click on that one. We're gonna keep it simple by just choosing an angle. So this is the angle of the lighting. So the lighting that's causing the shadow. So we just wanna match whatever's going on in the scene. The opacity slider will make it either opaque, so it's just completely black, or of course we can fade it away to be nothing. We just really want it subtle. We don't want what I call big hairy drop shadows because those just look nasty. We can adjust the distance, how far that shadow is going to be cast from the object. So obviously if we had the shadow like way over here, it looks like the cherry is floating. So we're going to drag that up. So it should be like pretty close. The size then has to do with like the size of the light source. So a large light source is going to produce a very soft shadow, and a small light source is producing a hard shadow. So again, you just want to kind of match what's going on in the scene. When we're happy with everything, we'll press OK. And then let's take a look at what happens in our layers panel. We now have a little effects icon here, and we see that we've added a drop shadow down below. We can toggle the effects on and off so we can see if we like it or not by clicking the little visibility icon. And if we decide we want to tweak it, like I think maybe the distance should be a little bit less, I'm going to just double click right on the words drop shadow, and then we'll be right back where we were, and I can take the distance and maybe reduce it a little. So we'll call that good. Now, here is what's really cool. We need to take that same drop shadow and we need to apply it to the whipped cream and the 3 ice cream scoops. But it would be a real pain if we had to recreate it every time. So instead what we're gonna do is copy that layer style and paste it to all the others. And the easiest way to do that is to hold down Alt or Option, and then I'm gonna click and drag this effects and just drop it on the whip layer, you see, and it added it. Then I'm gonna keep holding Alt or Option and click and drag it. We don't need to add it to the spoon, but we will add it to the yellow scoop. And if we click, we can just add it to that whole folder. So that's nice. And keep holding Alt Option, and again, drag and drop to the pink scoop, and one more time to the green scoop. Now we don't need it on the cone because the cone is standing in space and it's creating a cast shadow that way. If you look closely, you might spot a little problem, and that is the shadow is now also behind the ice cream. That makes it look as if the ice cream is right up against the background, and we can tell by this shadow that it's not. So we need the drop shadows to appear on the scoops, but not on the background. You might think you could just mask it away, but that's not going to work in this case. So we're going to extract the shadow that's applied to the layer. We're going to separate the shadow from the layer, and then we're going to clip the shadow to the layer below it. And what that does is it will make it so that that shadow only appears wherever it overlaps the layer below. Let me demonstrate. So on the cherry layer, if I right or control click on the drop shadow entry and we look down, there's a little known option here called Create Layer. And then Photoshop's going to yell at me and tell me that some aspects can't be reproduced with layers. That's fine. So we'll say, don't show me that again, and we'll click OK. And now we see that Photoshop has separated the drop shadow effect from the layer. So now the shadow is no longer just an effect that's applied to the cherry. The shadow is its own layer. And we're going to repeat that process for the whipped cream. So control click or right click on the drop shadow for the whipped cream and choose Create Layer. And again for the yellow scoop and the pink scoop, and finally the green scoop. Okay, and what's cool is Photoshop kept the name, and I love that it even like makes it possessive. So the shadow that was applied to the whip layer now is called Whip's Drop Shadow. I just think that's cute. So nothing changed in our image. When we look over here, the shadow is still on the background and everything. But now we're gonna do the clipping. And let's scroll back up to the top. So we'll start with the cherries drop shadow layer. And I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and hover my cursor in between till I get that funny looking icon with a square and a little downward arrow. And then I'm going to click. And we see that this layer indents, and it also has a little arrow pointing down now. So that is a visual indicator that this layer, the drop shadow that used to be applied to the cherry itself, now it's its own layer, and now it's only visible where it overlaps the whip layer. So if I zoom in so you can really see this, and if I toggle it on and off, so I'm going to hold down Alt or Option and just repeatedly clip it and unclip it, you can see how that shadow's disappearing from the background. And if I toggle it on and off, you can see that it still exists on the scoop. And in fact, if I grab my move tool and just drag that shadow around, you can see the shadows just floating, but you can see it doesn't go onto the background. It only is visible wherever it overlaps with the layer that it's clipped to. So we're now going to clip all of those shadow layers to the layers below them. So let's take a look. We have Whip's drop shadow next. Ooh, we need to move Whip's drop shadow. We need to move Whip's drop shadow because we don't want to clip it to the spoon. And the clipping can only happen to the layer directly below. So you can't clip a layer from up here down to a layer 10 layers below. So we need to do a little rearranging. We're going to take Whip's drop shadow and we're going to drag it on top of the yellow scoop folder. Now we'll clip it by holding Alt or Option. And now we see it disappears from the background, but it still is visible down here where it overlaps the yellow scoop. So let's move on down here to the yellow scoop's drop shadow, and we want to clip that to the pink scoop. So still holding Alt or Option and click in between and target the pink scoops drop shadow, Alt or Option and click to clip it to the green scoop. And finally, we want to take the green scoops drop shadow and clip it to the cone. Alt or Option and click in between. And there we go. And again, you can see now we can drag this around. You can see the drip shadow right there. We can move this around and it's only going to appear where it overlaps the cone. I'm realizing that I didn't get the best selection on the cherries. So at the bottom of the layers panel, we're going to click that little rectangle with the circle. I'll press B to grab a brush tool and make sure I've got black down here. And now I'm just going to paint the very bottom of that away. Easy fix. Okay, we have done all the hard work and now we are ready for the final touch, and it's my favorite. So we are going to add sprinkles to our ice cream and we're going to make them from scratch. So rather than copying and pasting something from another image, we're going to just generate our own sprinkles. We are going to start by making a new blank layer. So until this point, all of the layers have been created for us as a byproduct of something else we were doing, whether we were pasting something or we came down here and clicked to make an adjustment layer. The layer itself was created in some other way other than us. So this time we are going to make the layer. So at the bottom of the layers panel, we're going to click the little plus icon right here. This is the create a new layer button. I'm going to rename this. So double click and I'm going to call it sprinkles. So let's go grab our brush tool. So I'll press B for brush, and up here in the control panel where we see the little preview, that little round dot, I'm going to click that, and then I want to scroll through the brushes and you want to choose the hard round brush. Double click that to select it, and then we're going to open up our brush behavior settings. So that is this little button right here that's a folder with a brush on it. So with the brush tip shape selected over here, we're going to increase the spacing to 250%. So you can drag the slider or you can type it in. Then we'll come down and click Shape Dynamics. And we want the size jitter to be, let's say, 15%. Next, one of my favorites, we're going to click to turn on and apply scattering. And we're going to scatter way high, like 750%. And that, as you can see, takes all those little dots and scatters them from the path that we draw or paint with. So you can see it's starting to look like sprinkles. Then we're going to come down to color dynamics. And we're going to take the foreground background jitter and drag that all the way to the right. So that means that as we're painting, Photoshop is going to go back and forth between our foreground and background color and everything in between. And in addition to that, we also want to let Photoshop reach and stretch the hue a little bit. So that is the hue jitter here. And I'm going to give it a 30% hue jitter number. And I think that's going to be great. And last thing we need to do is select the colors to paint with. So I'm going to open my swatches panel. If you don't have it on your screen, you can go to Window, Swatches, and pop it open, and then find a nice bright pink in this case. That makes it my foreground color. I want a background color. So I'm going to hold down Alt or Option, and I'm going to click a nice bold yellow. So I've got pink foreground, yellow background, get rid of the swatches panel. And right now I happen to have a 40 pixel brush, but I'm going to make that smaller by pressing the left bracket key or the right bracket key if you need to make it bigger. But I want my brush to be 20 pixels. So here is the super fun part. We're ready to paint. Go ahead and click to paint sprinkles onto your ice cream. So obviously we don't want these sprinkles appearing on top of the cherry. So we're going to drag the sprinkles below the cherry layer, but we don't want to get in between Cherry's drop shadow and the whip layer. Because remember, that cherry drop shadow is clipped to the whip layer. This is my favorite ta-da moment. So I've applied all these effects to the style holder layer and we can see them. We know they're there because there's an effects icon. And if we open up this little drawer, we see, whoa, there is an inner shadow, a color overlay, a pattern overlay, and a drop shadow. In this moment, we're just gonna copy them to the sprinkles layer. So I'm gonna hold down Alt or Option, and I'm gonna click either the effects right here or the word effects over here. Hold down Alt or Option and then drag and drop that on sprinkles. Are you ready? Are you ready? Bam! Look at the balls now. Let me just undo that and take a look. So now, before we apply those effects, we just have flat dots, flat discs. But now when we apply all those effects, they turn into spherical sprinkles with drop shadows, and if we zoom in, you can see that they even have a little bit of texture added to them. So I just think that that is so much fun that I want to add even more sprinkles. So I'm going to go back to my sprinkles layer, and I still have my paintbrush, so I'm just gonna toss a few more sprinkles around on the ground. I so hope you enjoyed that whole exercise as much as I enjoyed making it. And don't forget to pick up your free thank you gift. You can swing by and download your copy of my Make It Snow toolkit. I hope you had fun today and that I will get to see you in one of my other online Photoshop classes sometime soon. Until then, happy Photoshopping.